just wanted to set the stage and talk about what web development was like at the time React was being developed. So I was working in the industry at this time. I'd been doing web development for a long time, even before this. And I always think of it, I don't know what other people call it, but I always think of it as the third phase of front-end development, at least JavaScript front-end development. So first phase I call the DHTML phase, dynamic HTML. That's what we used to call it. Basically, you'd start with an HTML web page, and then you'd be like, oh, I want this button to have a cool rollover effect when I mouse over it. And a lot of the stuff we did with it was probably completely unnecessary. But it was sort of like, wow, we could do these cool things with technology. We try to make these really bad animations with images and stuff. But the way a lot of people did, front-end JavaScript web development, what you did basically was really short snippets like that. They weren't really applications per se. You just copy in a few lines of JavaScript to animate something or make something happen. It's really simple. You didn't really have internal state for your application within the front end or anything. If you did any of that, it was usually, PHP and back end stuff where you kept your state, you kept it in the URL. You really didn't do a whole lot in JavaScript for the most part, most people. The second phase I call the Ajax phase. Basically, this is when we started actually making more what you would think of as modern front end, fully dynamic, interactive front ends with JavaScript. This was usually done with a library called jQuery, which just sort of smoothed out a lot of really basic stuff like event handlers and selectors across browsers, and just made a lot of things a little bit simpler and easier. But yeah, this was, I remember the time Gmail was coming out and other things that were really pushing forward more client-heavy JavaScript-based front ends that were more like desktop applications. So I call this the Ajax phase, the sort of initial web application development. But then third, after that, and this is more the phase that I think React was coming out of, and that is what I call the MVC or frameworkification phase of web development. So basically, we built all these front-end client applications we used jQuery and there were some other libraries, but for the most part we wrote things in pretty simple JavaScript. But what happened was we started getting internal front-end state, and you have to connect that to what the user is interacting with, to the browser, to the DOM. And so it was a lot of you set up some maybe global variables or somewhat local variables within your application, and they would store state like user clicked on this, user did this, user typed this, basic stuff. And then whenever things changed, you had to receive the event from the DOM, connect it to your internal state, update your internal state, and then if maybe there's some side effects from that, like, oh, the user typed this, now we want to have the UI do this, then you have to manually write the code to select the DOM element and use whatever JavaScript API is required to update that DOM element in the browser. And so it's a lot of really manual, tedious work to connect state from the front end internally to the browser. And so I think, and this is really hard to do. And yeah, if you ever programmed in this era, it was such a pain to do in an even remotely bug-free way. It's just hard to manually do that. And a lot of times what would happen is you would be working in the code and maybe some other people, and so you wouldn't quite know how they connected everything together. So you would think, okay, I can update this and it will update on the DOM and this should be handled. And then turns out it's only handled part of the time, and so your internal state becomes out of sync with what's seen in DOM, but only in some cases, and you get bug reports from users, and it's really hard to track down, really hard to fix. It was a big nightmare, and so it makes a lot of sense that we saw solutions to this. And so this is where we get into why I call it the MVC and frameworkification phase. So I think what happened was a lot of people saw the spaghetti code, saw these bugs, and they're like, there's got to be a better way. I think what happened was, especially a lot of the large companies that actually promoted some open source solutions, I think they sort of took what they were doing on the server side, especially in Java and frameworks like that, languages like that, which were really popular, especially at that time at larger companies. I think they took some of those solutions and were like, oh, let's apply them to the front end. And it wasn't, I don't think, very organic, or I think it was more of this top-down design approach, like let's try to shove some organization into solving these problems. And so there were tons of libraries and frameworks coming out at the time, all trying to solve this big problem that we had. But I don't, so from my perspective, I would check these out, and I was always like, this doesn't feel right. This feels like a lot of boilerplate code. This feels like just a lot of code without much purpose, or it really just adds complexity. So sure, it might fix some of this problem, but just creates more problems by adding more complexity. So I wasn't really impressed with any of the solutions. I don't know. I think maybe this is when Angular was getting started and other frameworks like that. And it's very MVC focused. You had to do things in MVC. If you weren't doing MVC, people were just like, oh no, that's not right. You gotta like go really hardcore and have all this extra framework stuff. And I hated it. I tried it. I didn't like it. I didn't think it made things better. I didn't think it solved the main issue really either, which was keeping state in sync with the DOM. So that's the era that we find ourselves in. It's this era of really trying to find solutions to this big problem that we had created by making more interactive front-end applications.